It was a sunny Saturday morning in the suburban town of Brighton Falls, where 16-year-old Derek Williams enjoyed playing basketball with his friends at the neighborhood park. Derek, a lanky, athletic teenager with dark brown skin and neatly cropped hair, had a deep love for the sport. The park was a common ground where the youth from different backgrounds and neighborhoods mingled, bonded, and showcased their basketball skills. This morning, Derek was feeling particularly confident as he executed a flawless layup, drawing cheers from his small circle of friends. The park was alive with the sounds of sneakers squeaking, basketballs bouncing, and joyful laughter. However, the peaceful vibe of the morning was about to take a drastic turn. Derek's father, David Williams, was a senior agent in the FBI, a dedicated professional who worked tirelessly to uphold justice. Despite his demanding job, David had always made sure to instill in Derek a sense of pride in his heritage, intelligence, and resilience in the face of adversity. But David never spoke much about his profession, preferring to live a private and peaceful life with his wife, Stella, and their son. The Williams family was well respected in their community, known for their integrity and humility. That day, as Derek played his game, he noticed a group of older boys, white, around his age, lingering at the edge of the court, watching him and his friends. These boys weren't unfamiliar. They were from a wealthier neighborhood nearby and had a reputation for causing trouble. Derek had often overheard them making disparaging comments or sneering whenever he and his friends played basketball at the park. One of them, a tall and heavy-set boy named Kevin Maddox, stepped onto the court with his friends. Kevin was known for being confrontational and condescending, but this time, he seemed particularly agitated. He called out to Derek, taunting him with insults that hinted at deep-seated prejudice. "Hey, why don't you let the real players have a turn?" Kevin jeered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Or are you afraid we'll show you what real skill looks like?" Derek, who had learned from his parents to always hold his head high, chose to ignore the provocation. He tried to continue his game, but Kevin's insults became louder and more pointed. Eventually, Kevin shoved Derek, knocking the ball from his hands. Derek turned around, his expression tense, but he held back from retaliating, knowing that responding with violence would only escalate the situation. The tension between the two groups reached its peak when a middle-aged white police officer named Officer Brad Matthews arrived at the park. Officer Matthews was notorious in the neighborhood for his biased treatment of minority teenagers. He was a stern, broad-shouldered man with a hard gaze and an unmistakable chip on his shoulder. Known for being quick to judge and slow to listen, he took pride in keeping the peace, but his actions often seemed to favor the more affluent residents of Brighton Falls. Seeing the commotion, Officer Matthews approached with a swagger, immediately assuming that Derek and his friends were the troublemakers. Without asking any questions, he barked at Derek. "Hey you! What's going on here?" Derek raised his hands slightly, his expression neutral. "Nothing, sir. We were just playing." Before Derek could finish his sentence, Officer Matthews cut him off, his voice dripping with authority and disdain. "I didn't ask for your excuses, kid. I saw you causing trouble, and I'm not gonna let you and your friends ruin this park for everyone else." Kevin and his friends stood to the side, smirking as Officer Matthews berated Derek. They didn't try to defend Derek or admit their role in the altercation. Instead, they played the role of innocent bystanders, enjoying the humiliation unfolding before them. Derek felt his heart racing with anger and embarrassment. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the park as people stopped to watch the scene. His friends stood by silently, their expressions a mix of fear and helplessness. They knew that arguing with the officer could lead to more trouble, and their parents had warned them to always be cautious in situations like these. "Empty your pockets," Officer Matthews ordered, his hand resting on his holster. The implication was clear, and Derek felt his stomach drop. He had heard enough stories from his father and seen enough news reports to know how these situations often ended. "I didn't do anything wrong," Derek protested, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just—" "Are you talking back to me, boy?" Officer Matthews snapped, stepping closer to Derek with a look of authority that sent a chill down Derek's spine. "No, sir," Derek replied quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ignoring Derek's plea, Officer Matthews grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, pushing him roughly against the hood of his patrol car. The metal felt cold against Derek's cheek, and he could hear his friends shouting in protest. But their voices were distant, muffled by the sound of his racing heartbeat. "Looks like you're getting a trip downtown, kid," Officer Matthews said with a sneer. "Maybe this will teach you and your little gang not to cause trouble around here." As Derek felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around his wrists, he fought back tears of frustration and humiliation. He couldn't believe this was happening to him, especially when he knew he had done nothing wrong. His thoughts raced, trying to remember everything his father had taught him about staying calm and not resisting. But it was hard to focus with the weight of everyone's judgmental stares pressing down on him. "Dad," Derek whispered under his breath, as if hoping that somehow his father would sense his distress and come to his rescue. Little did he know, his father was not far away, and things were about to take a dramatic turn. David Williams was on his way home from work when he decided to take a short detour through the neighborhood park. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by and watch Derek play basketball on weekends, even if just for a few minutes. It was his way of staying connected with his son amidst the demands of his job. David had spent the better part of his career with the FBI, earning a reputation for his calm demeanor and keen sense of justice. He was known to be meticulous and fair, traits he had tried to instill in Derek from a young age. As David approached the park, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the basketball court. His instincts kicked in immediately, sensing that something was wrong. He parked his car on the side of the road and made his way toward the group. As he got closer, he heard Officer Matthews' voice and recognized it instantly. David's heart sank. He knew Matthews all too well. The officer had a reputation for being harsh and heavy-handed, especially with young black boys in the neighborhood. David quickened his pace, pushing through the gathering crowd until he saw Derek, handcuffed and pressed against the hood of the patrol car. The sight of his son in such a vulnerable position sent a surge of anger through him, but years of training and experience told him to remain calm. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and approached the officer. "Excuse me, Officer Matthews," David called out, his voice steady but laced with authority. "What's going on here?" Officer Matthews turned to face David, his expression stern and unyielding. He gave David a once-over, noticing his professional attire but not recognizing who he was. "Just handling some troublemakers, sir," Matthews replied dismissively. "This kid here and his friends were causing a disturbance in the park." David's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced at Derek, who was staring back at him with a mixture of relief and shame. David could see the tears welling up in his son's eyes, and it took all his self-control to keep his emotions in check. "Is that so?" David said, his tone cool and measured. "What exactly did they do to warrant this kind of treatment?" Officer Matthews shifted uncomfortably under David's intense gaze but maintained his stance. "They were causing trouble," he repeated, "and when I confronted them, this one," he gestured to Derek, "gave me attitude. So I'm taking him in for questioning." David nodded slowly, as if considering the officer's words. "I see. And did you witness this alleged trouble yourself, or are you taking the word of bystanders?" he asked pointedly. The question caught Matthews off guard, and he hesitated for a moment before replying. I saw enough to know that he's a troublemaker," he stammered, his confidence wavering slightly. David took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Matthews could hear him. "Officer Matthews, I'd like to inform you that you're speaking to Special Agent David Williams of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice firm. "Now, I'm going to ask you again. What did my son do to deserve this kind of treatment?" The color drained from Officer Matthews' face as he processed David's words. His eyes widened in shock, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had clearly underestimated the man standing before him, and the realization was starting to sink in. "Agent Williams, I didn't know," Matthews stammered, fumbling for an explanation. "I was just trying to keep the peace, sir." David remained silent for a moment, his expression hardening. He turned his gaze to Derek, who was still handcuffed, and then back to Matthews. "Keeping the peace," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. By handcuffing a young boy who was playing basketball with his friends? By treating him like a criminal without any evidence or justification? Matthew's face turned red with embarrassment and panic. He opened his mouth to respond, but David held up a hand to stop him. "Remove the handcuffs," David ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitated for a moment, then quickly reached for the key and unlocked Derek's handcuffs. Derek rubbed his wrists, feeling a mixture of relief and anger. His father's presence had diffused the situation, but the humiliation lingered, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being powerless in that moment. "Derek," David said softly, his tone shifting from authoritative to gentle. "Are you okay?" Derek nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. He felt a lump forming in his throat, and he struggled to swallow it down. David turned his attention back to Officer Matthews, who was now fidgeting nervously, avoiding eye contact. "I'm going to report this incident, Officer Matthews," David said coldly, "and I suggest you reflect on how you handle situations like this in the future. You're here to protect and serve, not to abuse your authority." Matthews stammered an apology, but David didn't wait to hear it. He placed a reassuring hand on Derek's shoulder and began leading him away from the scene. As they walked, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Some of Derek's friends called out to him, asking if he was okay, and he gave them a small nod in response. David and Derek reached the car, and David opened the passenger door for his son. Derek slid into the seat, feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. David got in on the driver's side and started the engine, but he didn't pull away immediately. He took a deep breath and turned to face his son. "Derek," he said gently, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Derek shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not your fault, Dad." "No," David replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "But it's my responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I promise you, Derek, I won't let this slide." Derek looked at his father, seeing the fierce resolve in his eyes, and for the first time since the incident began, he felt a glimmer of hope. His father wasn't just a protective parent. He was a man who understood the weight of justice and fairness, and Derek knew he wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As they drove away from the park, Derek leaned back in his seat, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his body. The anger and humiliation still lingered, but there was also a sense of relief in knowing that he wasn't alone in this fight. His father had his back, and that made all the difference. Little did they know, this incident was only the beginning of a series of events that would challenge their understanding of justice and change their lives forever. The drive home was quiet, each passing street filled with unspoken tension. David Williams gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the incident at the park over and over. He couldn't shake the image of Derek's face pressed against the patrol car's hood, and it made his blood boil. David had encountered his fair share of injustice in his career, but seeing his own son in that position hit differently. It was a stark reminder that no matter how successful or respected he was, the world saw his son through a different lens. Derek, slumped in the passenger seat, felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He was usually the easygoing type, quick with a joke and always smiling. But today, all he felt was anger and shame. He had never experienced such blatant racism before, at least not so directly. The humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his friends, the cold metal biting into his wrists, and the scornful eyes of the crowd replayed in his mind like a haunting loop. When they pulled into the driveway, Stella Williams was waiting on the porch, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as she saw their faces. She rushed to them as they got out of the car, her eyes widening with concern. Stella was a petite woman with warm, brown skin and curly hair that she usually wore in a stylish updo. Despite her small stature, she had a strong presence and was fiercely protective of her family. "What happened?" Stella demanded, looking from Derek to David. "Why do you both look so?" "Not now, Stella," David interrupted softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go inside first." They entered the house, and as the door closed behind them, the walls seemed to absorb the lingering tension. Derek headed straight for the living room, collapsing onto the couch with a heavy sigh. Stella followed him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Derek," she said gently, sitting beside him. "What happened at the park?" Derek hesitated for a moment, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. He had always confided in his mother, but this was different. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and he wasn't sure how to express the mix of anger and hurt that churned inside him. But one look at his mother's concerned eyes, and the dam broke. "Some kids from the other neighborhood started messing with us," Derek began, his voice shaky. "And then this cop, Officer Matthews, showed up and he just assumed we were causing trouble. He handcuffed me, Mom, in front of everyone." Stella's eyes widened, her expression shifting from shock to anger. "He did what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't even ask what happened," Derek continued, his voice rising with frustration. He looked at me like I was some kind of criminal." Stella took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for her son's sake, but it was clear she was struggling. She turned to David, her eyes demanding an explanation. "David, what did you do?" David had been standing by the doorway, watching his son with a mixture of sadness and anger. He met Stella's gaze and sighed heavily. "I intervened before things got worse," he said quietly. "But I'm going to make sure this doesn't end here." "What do you mean?" Stella pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm filing a formal complaint against Officer Matthews," David replied, his voice resolute. "This kind of behavior can't go unchecked. Not when it's happening to our son." Stella nodded, her jaw clenched. "Good," she said firmly. "He needs to be held accountable." Derek felt a wave of relief hearing his parents talk about taking action, but it didn't completely erase the anger simmering inside him. He appreciated their support, but he couldn't forget the looks on the faces of Kevin and his friends. The smug satisfaction on Kevin's face when Derek was being cuffed made him feel like a target, and that realization was hard to swallow. Over the next few days, news of the incident spread like wildfire through the town. Derek's friends and classmates reached out to him, offering their support and sharing their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. But there were also whispers. People who questioned what Derek must have done to provoke the officer, people who believed in the stereotype rather than the person. Derek couldn't escape the whispers, not even at school. Kevin and his group of friends continued to throw snide comments his way, confident in their untouchable status. They would laugh and mock him, and Derek had to fight the urge to lash out. His father's words echoed in his mind, warning him not to let anger cloud his judgment, but it was easier said than done. The turning point came during lunch, when Kevin approached Derek's table with a smug grin. Derek was sitting with his friends, trying to focus on his food, but he couldn't ignore the looming presence of his tormentor. "Hey, Derek," Kevin sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How's it feel to get arrested in front of the whole park? Bet your dad's real proud." Derek felt his hands clench into fists under the table, his anger flaring. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but Kevin's next words pushed him over the edge. "You know, maybe if you didn't act so suspicious, the cops wouldn't be on your case all the time," Kevin continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Just a thought." The table went silent, and Derek's friends looked at him nervously. They knew he was on the edge, and they didn't want to see him get in more trouble. But Derek couldn't hold it in any longer. He stood up, his eyes locked on Kevin. "What's your problem, man?" Derek demanded, his voice steady but seething with anger. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" Kevin laughed, clearly enjoying the reaction he was getting. "My problem? You're the one with the problem, always thinking you're the victim," he taunted. Before Derek could respond, a teacher approached, sensing the escalating tension. She stepped between them, her voice stern. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes narrowing at Kevin. "Nothing, Miss Taylor," Kevin said innocently, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just having a friendly conversation." Miss Taylor didn't look convinced, but she couldn't pinpoint what was happening. She turned to Derek, her expression softening. "Derek, are you okay?" Derek swallowed hard, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to say so much, to call out Kevin for his constant harassment, but he knew it would only lead to more trouble. So he forced himself to nod. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered. Miss Taylor lingered for a moment, then nodded reluctantly and walked away. Kevin flashed a smirk at Derek, but before he could say anything else, Derek's friend Jamal stood up, stepping between them. "Back off, Kevin," Jamal warned, his voice low. "Before you get yourself in real trouble." Kevin looked between Derek and Jamal, weighing his options, and finally shrugged. "Whatever," he muttered, turning and walking away. Derek sank back into his seat, feeling a mix of anger and frustration. He was tired of feeling powerless, tired of being seen as a target. He knew that standing up to Kevin would only make things worse, but staying silent felt like giving in. And the hardest part was knowing that the same people who whispered behind his back at school would be the ones sitting on the sidelines, watching and doing nothing. It was time for things to change. And Derek knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed his father's help to fight this battle, and he needed to find his voice to confront not just Kevin, but the system that allowed people like Kevin and Officer Matthews to feel invincible. As Derek and his father David sat in their living room that evening, the atmosphere was heavy with a sense of urgency and tension. The events of the last few days had sparked something in both of them. Derek couldn't shake the feeling of anger and powerlessness, while David wrestled with his own sense of responsibility. Not just as a father, but as a man committed to justice. "Dad," Derek finally spoke, breaking the silence. "I'm tired of feeling like I have to keep quiet and just take it. Kevin, Officer Matthews, all of them. They think they can treat people like me this way and get away with it." David looked at his son, seeing the determination in his eyes. He felt a mixture of pride and pain. Proud that Derek wanted to stand up for himself, but pained by the realization that his son had to fight this battle in the first place. "You're right," David replied, his voice steady. "And you shouldn't have to keep quiet. What happened to you at the park was wrong, Derek. What that officer did was an abuse of power, and Kevin's behavior is nothing short of harassment." Derek nodded, feeling a surge of validation from his father's words. But he knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of resolve and uncertainty. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We're going to file a formal complaint against Officer Matthews," he said. "And we're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. But it's not just about the police, Derek. You have a right to feel safe at school, too. We need to talk to your principal about what's been happening with Kevin." Derek felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Talking to the principal about Kevin felt like walking into a lion's den. Kevin was popular and well-connected, and Derek had no doubt that the principal would be hesitant to take action against him. But he also knew that his father was right. Ignoring the problem wasn't going to make it go away. "Okay," Derek said quietly. "But what if they don't believe me? What if nothing changes?" David placed a hand on Derek's shoulder, his expression firm. "Then we keep pushing," he replied. "You're not alone in this, Derek. Your mom and I are with you every step of the way. And if we have to go higher up, we will." The next morning, David called a family meeting at the kitchen table. He and Stella sat across from Derek, ready to lay out a plan. Stella had been the one to insist on a full strategy. She was a problem solver by nature, and she refused to let her son face this challenge unprepared. "Derek," Stella began, her voice gentle but firm. "We're going to go to the principal's office together. Your father and I will be there with you, and we'll make sure they hear your side of the story. But I need you to be completely honest and confident when you speak." Derek nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. His parents' support gave him the strength to face what was coming, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Later that day, they arrived at Brighton Falls High School and made their way to the principal's office. Principal Ms. Olivia Thompson was a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, known for her strict adherence to school policy and her reluctance to acknowledge the deeper social issues that occasionally surfaced in her school. She was a tall, thin woman with graying hair and sharp features, her eyes always seeming to scrutinize whoever sat in front of her. As the Williams family sat in her office, Ms. Thompson regarded them with a neutral expression. She was familiar with David Williams' reputation, and she understood the implications of him showing up in her office. But she was also aware of Kevin Maddox's status as the son of a prominent local businessman, which made this situation all the more delicate. "So, Mr. Williams," Ms. Thompson began, folding her hands on her desk. "What seems to be the issue?" David glanced at Derek, silently encouraging him to speak. Taking a deep breath, Derek recounted the events of the past few days: the incident at the park, Kevin's continued harassment, and the racial undertones that accompanied it all. He spoke with clarity and conviction, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Ms. Thompson listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When Derek finished, she turned to David. "Mr. Williams," she said carefully, "this is a serious accusation. Kevin Maddox is well regarded by his teachers and peers. Are you certain there isn't a misunderstanding here?" David's eyes narrowed slightly. "Principal Thompson, my son isn't fabricating this. He's been targeted by Kevin for months, and the incident at the park was just the tipping point. We're not here to make accusations without cause. We're here because this is a clear case of bullying and harassment, and it needs to be addressed." Ms. Thompson sighed, her fingers drumming on the desk. "I understand your concern," she replied. "But as you know, these matters are delicate. Kevin's parents are heavily involved in the community. I need to handle this with care." Stella, who had remained silent up until now, leaned forward, her expression stern. "Principal Thompson, with all due respect, this isn't about community politics or maintaining appearances," she said firmly. "This is about the safety and well-being of our son. If you won't take this seriously, then we'll take it up with the school board." Ms. Thompson's eyes widened slightly at the threat, but she quickly composed herself. "I'll look into this matter personally," she said, her voice stiff. "In the meantime, I'll have a word with Kevin and make it clear that this behavior won't be tolerated." Derek wasn't entirely satisfied with Ms. Thompson's response, but he knew it was a start. He had spoken his truth, and now it was up to the administration to follow through. As they left the principal's office, Derek felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The conversation hadn't gone exactly as he'd hoped, but at least the issue was out in the open. And with his parents backing him up, he felt more confident than ever that they could make a difference. Later that evening, Derek and his father sat in the living room, the TV flickering in the background. Derek glanced at his father, feeling a surge of gratitude for everything he had done. "Thanks, Dad," Derek said quietly, "for being there for me." David smiled, a rare expression of warmth breaking through his usually serious demeanor. "I'm always here for you, Derek," he replied. "And we're not done yet. Tomorrow, we're filing that complaint against Officer Matthews." Derek nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. Little did they know, the complaint against Officer Matthews would set off a chain of events that would shake the foundations of Brighton Falls and challenge the town's long-held beliefs about race, justice, and accountability. The following day, David and Derek walked into the Brighton Falls Police Department. The air was tense with unspoken words, and Derek couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and determination. He had been at this station before for school visits and community events, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't here to see how officers kept the peace, but to hold one of them accountable. David approached the front desk, where a young officer looked up with mild curiosity. "I'd like to file a formal complaint against Officer Brad Matthews," David stated, his voice steady and unwavering. The officer's demeanor shifted immediately, his curiosity replaced with guarded professionalism. "Of course, sir," he replied, gesturing for them to take a seat. "Someone will be with you shortly." While they waited, Derek felt his heart pounding. He glanced at his father, who seemed lost in thought, his jaw clenched. The minutes felt like hours until a sergeant called them into a small, sterile office. The sergeant was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weathered face that seemed to have seen its fair share of conflicts. "What can I help you with?" the sergeant asked, his tone professionally neutral. David took a deep breath and began recounting the incident at the park. He detailed Officer Matthews' aggressive actions and the lack of evidence to justify detaining Derek. The sergeant listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes but offering no indication of his thoughts. When David finished, he handed over a written statement he had prepared in advance. "We expect this to be taken seriously," David said, his voice firm. "Not just swept under the rug." The sergeant nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "I assure you, Mr. Williams, we will conduct a thorough investigation," he replied, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. Derek wasn't sure whether to trust him, but he knew this was only the beginning. As they left the station, Derek felt a sense of relief mixed with uncertainty. He knew that filing a complaint didn't guarantee justice, but it was a step in the right direction. His father had always taught him that silence was complicity, and now he understood what that truly meant. Meanwhile, back at school, the news of Derek's actions spread quickly. Some students admired his courage, while others whispered behind his back, still doubting his version of events. Kevin's circle continued to mock him, but their taunts felt less impactful now that Derek had taken action. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was fighting back. At home, David received a call from the police department, informing him that an internal review had been initiated. The next steps were unclear, but for now, all the Williams family could do was wait. As days turned into weeks, the tension in the air remained, but so did their resolve. They had lit a spark, and now it was time to see if that spark would ignite a much-needed change in Brighton Falls. A few weeks later, the Williams family received a letter from the Brighton Falls Police Department. The letter, signed by the department's Internal Affairs Division, stated that Officer Matthews had been placed on temporary suspension pending an investigation into his conduct. It wasn't the full resolution David and Derek had hoped for, but it was a significant first step. The system was taking notice, and that in itself felt like a small victory. However, this victory was not without its challenges. The suspension of Officer Matthews stirred up controversy within the community. Some residents were supportive, praising the Williams family for their courage to stand up against injustice. Others, particularly those with ties to the police or wealthier neighborhoods, voiced their displeasure openly. They believed Officer Matthews was being unfairly targeted, that he was only doing his job. The division in the community began to grow, and the Williams family found themselves at the center of it all. At school, Kevin's taunts became less frequent but more vicious. He seemed to resent the attention and sympathy Derek was receiving. One afternoon, as Derek was walking down the hallway, he overheard Kevin talking to a group of friends. "That kid's dad thinks he's some kind of hero," Kevin sneered. "He's just trying to make this about race because he's jealous of what we have." Derek felt a familiar anger rising within him, but this time, he didn't let it overwhelm him. Instead, he walked away, his mind racing. He knew that Kevin's words weren't just coming from a place of jealousy. They were rooted in a deeper belief system, one that Kevin had likely inherited from his parents and the community around him. That evening, Derek sat with his parents at the dinner table, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. David and Stella exchanged worried glances before David finally spoke up. "Derek, I know this has been hard on you," he said, his voice gentle. "But I'm proud of the way you're handling it. You've shown strength in the face of adversity, and that's not easy." Derek nodded, appreciating his father's words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. "Dad," he said quietly, "what if they don't believe us? What if nothing changes?" David took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight, son," he replied. "And it doesn't always happen the way we want it to. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. You've already made an impact, whether you realize it or not." Derek listened, feeling a flicker of hope reignite within him. His father's words reminded him that progress wasn't always about immediate results. Sometimes, it was about laying the groundwork for something bigger. As he thought about the people who had reached out to him, offering their support and sharing their own stories, he realized that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about challenging a system that allowed prejudice to thrive, and that was worth fighting for. Little did they know, the events that would unfold in the coming weeks would test their resolve like never before. The investigation into Officer Matthews was far from over, and Brighton Falls was about to face a reckoning that would change the town forever. As the investigation into Officer Matthews continued, Brighton Falls found itself increasingly divided. Community meetings were held, where heated arguments erupted between those who supported Derek and his family, and those who stood behind the officer. At one town hall meeting, David and Stella attended, quietly observing as neighbors they had known for years spoke out, some condemning Officer Matthews' actions, while others defended him fervently. In the midst of the tension, David and Derek were invited to speak at a community forum on race relations organized by local activists. The forum, held in a small church hall, was packed with residents of all backgrounds. Derek felt a mix of nerves and responsibility as he stepped up to the microphone. He glanced at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Derek began to speak about his experience, sharing not just the incident but the daily reality of being seen as suspicious for simply existing. "It's not just about one officer," Derek said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about the way people like me are treated every day. We want to be seen for who we are, not just for the color of our skin." The room fell silent as Derek finished speaking, his words lingering in the air. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain glances. David stood beside his son, feeling a mixture of pride and fear. They were challenging the status quo, and the consequences were unpredictable. As tensions grew, Derek and his family found unexpected allies in the fight. A group of students from Brighton Falls High School, both black and white, began organizing protests to show their support for Derek and call for systemic changes in the community. Derek's best friend, Jamal, played a key role in rallying students to attend the protests, spreading the word through social media and encouraging others to share their own experiences. One of the most surprising supporters was a teacher at the school, Ms. Laura Simmons, who had taught both Derek and Kevin. Ms. Simmons, a middle-aged white woman with a reputation for being strict but fair, reached out to Derek after hearing about his struggles. She met with the Williams family to express her support and to discuss ways to address racial issues at the school. "I've seen this kind of behavior before," Ms. Simmons admitted, her voice filled with regret. "I didn't always know how to handle it, but I can't stay silent anymore." Derek was surprised by her honesty, and her words gave him hope that not everyone in Brighton Falls was blind to the injustices happening around them. As protests continued, the school administration and local authorities began to feel the pressure to respond. Derek's voice, once silenced by fear and shame, was now becoming a catalyst for change. Little did they know, the biggest challenges were yet to come. The investigation into Officer Matthews was nearing its conclusion, and the decision would either validate Derek's fight or deepen the community's divisions. As the investigation into Officer Matthews drew to a close, the anticipation in Brighton Falls was palpable. Rumors circulated, and the community anxiously awaited the official announcement. Tensions flared, with each side firmly believing in their version of justice. Derek, despite his growing support, couldn't shake the lingering doubt that justice might elude them. But his parents remained steadfast, reminding him that regardless of the outcome, they had already made a difference by bringing these issues to light. The day of the announcement finally arrived. A press conference was held at the police department, with the town's media and residents gathering anxiously. Derek and his family stood together, their hands intertwined, as the police chief approached the podium. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and tension, as the police chief took a deep breath before reading the findings. "We have concluded our investigation into Officer Matthews' conduct during the incident involving Derek Williams," the chief began, his voice steady. "It is our finding that Officer Matthews' actions were in violation of department protocols and exhibited clear bias. Effective immediately, Officer Matthews has been terminated from his position." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief, anger, and relief. For Derek and his family, it was a moment of triumph and validation, but they knew this was only the beginning. The decision to fire Officer Matthews was a significant victory, but the systemic issues remained. Derek glanced at his father, who gave him a small nod, silently acknowledging the long road still ahead. Over the next few weeks, the focus shifted from Officer Matthews to the broader issues of racial bias and accountability within the town. Derek's case had become a catalyst for change, sparking conversations and reforms that had been long overdue. School policies were reviewed, and diversity training programs were introduced. Principal Thompson, seeing the writing on the wall, began to take a more active role in addressing the racial climate at Brighton Falls High School. Meanwhile, Derek and his allies continued their advocacy. They organized workshops, partnered with community leaders, and even started a social media campaign to raise awareness about issues of racial profiling and inequality. Derek had gone from being a victim of injustice to a voice for change, and he embraced the responsibility with newfound strength. Kevin Maddox, seeing the tide turn against him, gradually withdrew his taunts. His friends began distancing themselves from him, realizing that siding with prejudice only isolated them from a growing movement for unity. While Kevin never apologized to Derek directly, the shift in power dynamics was evident. Derek no longer felt like an outsider in his own school. He had found his place, surrounded by friends and allies who believed in a better future. One evening, as the Williams family sat together in the living room, reflecting on how much had changed, Derek felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had faced humiliation and discrimination, but through it all, he had found his voice, and with the unwavering support of his parents, he had become a catalyst for change in Brighton Falls. "I'm proud of you, Derek," David said, his voice full of warmth and pride. "You showed this town what courage looks like." Derek smiled, feeling the weight of his father's words. He had faced his fears, stood up against prejudice, and made a difference not just for himself, but for countless others. Brighton Falls still had a long way to go, but the journey toward justice had begun, and Derek knew he would continue to be part of that journey for as long as it took.